Welcome to the Logistics Point interviews. We are joined by Pauline Potter from EVRi, and we're going to talk about ESG and procurement. Pauline, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Nick.
So I just mentioned procurement and EVRi. On the first thing, we know that EVRi has this extremely ambitious ESG program. But when it comes to procurement, where does this tie up?
So EVRi has made a lot of public commitments around our wider ESG objectives. The most sort of notable of that is our carbon footprint commitment. So we are committed to being net zero by 2035. We have a number of other ambitions around sort of human rights management and our charity givings and things like that. But I would say our carbon footprint, being a logistics business, is obviously front of mind. Within that, so our scope 3 footprint is about 80% of our total footprint, and procurement obviously has responsibility for supporting scopes 1 and 2 as well, by the vehicles that we acquire and the electricity that we put in our buildings and things. Anything that we buy that's contributing to our carbon footprint ultimately does, my team has a bit of a responsibility for supporting our central ESG team.
How does a procurement team look like and operate when it comes to sort of marrying procurement and ESG at the same time? Is it different to what we are thinking when it comes to procurement people?
I wouldn't say it's different, but I think that procurement in general as a function is really changing at the moment. So our reason for existing is always driving value for the business. And I just think in the 80s and 90s, what that meant typically was price. And then there was a bit of a focus on quality. So it was procurement. Can you make sure you're balancing price and quality? And then we started having service disruption. So it was price and quality and service. But I think this is just the next evolution of that. So now what we look at, we still need to maintain that best value for money for the business. That's still really important. Each member of the procurement team also has to have front of mind and be speaking to their suppliers about what is your carbon footprint? What initiatives do you have in place around net zero commitments? And so when we're looking to award new business or even just managing suppliers day to day, you have kind of that review of not just your cost management, but also what are your carbon footprint impacts.
How did your procurement practices look like?
I would say before our public commitments, which were in 2021, off the back of many of our retailers made commitments themselves, and we were a significant part of their scope 3. So we obviously then make a commitment off the back of that. Prior to that, it wasn't like there was no ESG going on or that it wasn't on anyone's radar, but it certainly had less focus. So our procurement team only centralized in sort of 2017, 2018. Before that, everything was quite ad hoc across the business in terms of purchasing. So typically, that just meant whatever was fit for purpose for the site, usually focused on that cost and service side. When the team got centralized, some of the first things they did were things like bringing in CNG vehicles for our heavy goods fleet. So we did our first intake of those in 2018, just off the back of the procurement team was motivated to do that. And the total cost actually made a lot of sense because the vehicle's more expensive, but the fuel's much cheaper. But it wasn't really looked at in a systematic way. So we were doing a lot of your traditional procurement activity of tendering and contract management, but really looking at it from a cost perspective, rather than sort of more central and holistic saying this is what the overarching goal needs to be.
And how about the things that you felt need to be done? Firstly, how did you set, well, this is the first thing, then we are going to do this and this?
We work really closely with our central ESG team. So our head of ESG, Nancy Hobhouse, joined the business in 2021 and did an absolutely fantastic job of setting out over her sort of first 6 months at neck-breaking pace. Here are the ESG priorities for the business. So then for the fall of that year, she and I and our chief transformation officer had a bit of a sit down and said, well, here are all of our priorities. Which of these are either going to be influenced by our spend decisions, our purchasing decisions, or which of these actually do we need to be proactively saying there is a choice that we need to make instead of a different choice. So for example, is that the wording I'm using, apologies, is more like our procurement leading that, as in we need to be bringing opportunities to our ESG team to contribute to that goal, or our procurement supporting that in that we know what the priority is and we just need to go execute it with the supply base. Here's your top 3 things. And the first is carbon footprint in your fleet and buildings, and then in our scope 3. And then second around things like waste and packaging and that's some of the more visible, smaller categories.
And when it comes to procurement, you're certainly going to work with a lot of people that are outside of your organization. So how do you manage this relationship?
First is just making your expectations known. I think when I speak to peers and other organizations who are struggling the most with it, I think their biggest frustration is that suppliers aren't doing as much proactively as they would like. And I don't disagree with that, but I also think that we live in a world where you need to ask for what you want. So the first thing we did was just speak with all of our top suppliers and state quite clearly, this is our net zero commitment. So what we need from you is, in this order, much better data to contribute to our internal carbon footprinting. We need a commitment to net zero from yourselves, but potentially that can come, over time. Finally, we need you to be having a very clear roadmap like we do around how you are going to work towards that goal. So I think that was the first thing, was really just setting our expectations.
Is there something in the whole process that surprised you both positively, but also maybe in a way negatively?
The level of enthusiasm, both internally and externally, has been great to see. This is a topic I'm hugely passionate about myself. And I think that 5 years ago, most people saw it as a nice to have or at some point in this. I think that in 2023, every time we're asking the questions, we're actually getting engagement on them. The change and pace of change, but at least initial engagement on them is really positive. I think the negative that I've seen, which not necessarily a surprise, but is really the number of claims. And I don't think there's much intentional greenwashing. I think the phrase that's used more and more now is green wishing. Like they think that they're doing the right thing and want to do the right thing, but the way they're going about it is not actually accurate. So, suppliers who are saying, oh, we're carbon neutral, and what they mean by that is they just pay for offsets, and that's not the way we as EVRi want to achieve our goals. And they state that as though it's the same as making a net zero commitment. So there's things like that, or here's a transition in the type of material that we're using for a particular product, and all of their branding is around the ESG impact. And you ask for a little bit of backing data, and the sales manager just panics as though he's never been asked for that level of detail before.
Is there a set of questions or a list that you would recommend companies in logistics to go through?
Yes, definitely. So there's probably a couple of angles on that. So first, we've worked quite closely with the ESG team for what are the basic questions we should always be asking suppliers. So that's things like, do you have a net zero commitment? Do you measure your scope 1, 2, and 3 carbon footprint target? Do you report on that? To what level of data? That kind of thing. The second is we are part of a group called the Indirect Spend Alliance, which is a sort of cross-industry collaboration of about 20 different businesses led by Oliver Hurry. And that is basically for procurement professionals to come together for all of their indirect spend and put in place some really practical tools for kind of measuring and influencing supplier emissions as well as human rights risks. So we've developed things like one-pagers for your top risks, and there's a playbook on decarbonization initiatives that my team are then able to use for those specific categories.
How do you measure the success? Because what you mentioned is the green wishing is, yes, we believe as a company, for example, we are doing the right thing, but at the end of the day, the data needs to back it up. How do you make sure that this is actually happening?
I think that there's a couple sides. One is we do our monthly carbon footprint reporting, and we report that back to a lot of our major retail clients. So we do have good measurement. I appreciate that carbon accounting is not perfect still, and especially in scope 3, it's still quite a challenge. But what we've set the task for my team is contributing specifically to that scope 3 number. So that's sort of our first instance, and that should be nice and measurable, and that's something we can talk specifically to suppliers about how they are contributing to our scope 3, and what does the number look like at the start of the year versus the end of the year. Separately from that, I think there's also a case of, we know the data is not perfect. So one of my colleagues in the Indirect Spend Alliance, and his business always talks about these no regrets actions. So if it's something that even if we don't have a perfect measurement for it, is a bit of a no-brainer to do anyway, then just crack on and do it. And we'll talk about that as more of an activity-based rather than an outcome-based. So trying to get the balance between both of those two things.
Pauline, thank you very much for your time. And everyone watching can learn a bit more about ESG, the procurement of goods, services, and also a lot more about what EVRi is doing in the area in the description below. Thank you very much.